Suppose you hear that a country's GDP has increased by 10%. Does that always mean the economy has produced 10% more goods and services? Not necessarily. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we'll understand the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Learn how the GDP deflator connects these two and if is it different from inflation rate in any way. Let's begin. A rising GDP number can tell two different stories. First, the economy may genuinely be producing more goods and services. For example, a bakery selling 150 loaves instead of 100. Second, the bakery may still sell only 100 loaves, but each loaf now costs more. This general rise in prices could be due to inflation. If you would like to understand inflation in detail, I have covered it in a separate video. For now, let's focus on how economists remove this effect of inflation to measure true economic growth. So, an increase in GDP does not always mean an increase in production. Real GDP helps us identify whether the rise is genuine economic growth or simply the result of inflation. Now, let us understand the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP measures the value of current production using current year prices. It is therefore also called GDP at current prices. We calculate it by multiplying the current price of each good or service by its current quantity and then adding the values together. Because both price and quantity can change, nominal GDP reflects changes in production as well as inflation. Think of your grocery bill. Even when you buy the same quantity of rice, the bill rises if the price increases. Therefore, the nominal GDP can rise without any increase in actual output. Real GDP measures current production using the prices of a fixed base year. It is therefore also called GDP at constant prices. We calculate it by multiplying the current year quantity by the base year price. Since prices are kept constant, any change in real GDP must be due to a change in the quantity produced. Using our grocery example, we value this year's basket at last year's prices. The strength is that it removes the effect of inflation and shows whether the economy is genuinely producing more. Let us understand the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP using a simple numerical example. Assume the economy produces only one product. In year 1, the price is 10 and the quantity produced is 100 units. Nominal GDP is price multiplied by quantity. 10 multiplied by 100 equals 1000. Since year 1 is also our base year, real GDP is also 1000. Now look at year 2. The price increases from 10 to 12, but the quantity remains unchanged at 100 units. Nominal GDP uses the current year price. Therefore, 12 multiplied by 100 gives us 1200. To calculate real GDP, we keep the price fixed at base year price of 10. So, 10 multiplied by 100 by the current quantity of 100 gives us 1000. Notice that only the price changed. Since production remained at 100 units, real GDP stays the same. Nominal GDP has increased from 1000 to 1200, a rise of 20%. However, real GDP remains unchanged at 1000. Why is there a difference? Because the economy is still producing only 100 units. The entire increase in nominal GDP is due to the higher price and not higher production. Therefore, nominal GDP increased by 20%, but actual economic growth, which is measured by real GDP, was 0%. Remember to calculate real GDP in 3 simple steps. First, choose a base year and freeze its prices. Next, use the current quantities from the year we are measuring. Finally, multiply base year prices by current quantities and add them up. So, the key rule is current quantities, base year prices. Now that we know how real GDP is calculated, let's see how it is in comparison to nominal GDP. Nominal GDP uses current year prices, while real GDP uses base year prices. Nominal GDP reflects both price and output changes, while real GDP focuses on changes in actual output. And that is why real GDP is more useful for comparing economic growth over time. Now let's see why real GDP is so important. Both nominal GDP and real GDP begin at an index value of 100 in year 1. Over the next 5 years, nominal GDP rises sharply to 190. Did this economy almost double its output? Looking only at nominal GDP, we might think that the economy has almost doubled in size. However, real GDP reaches only 118, which tells us that actual production has increased by just 18%. The widening gap between the two lines reflects rising prices. In other words, much of the increase in nominal GDP is due to inflation, not an increase in real output. This is why economists rely on real GDP to measure true economic growth. The key takeaway is that economic growth refers to an increase in economy's real GDP over time. When economists discuss long-run growth, they usually mean sustained increases in real GDP. Rise in nominal GDP is not true economic growth because the increase is caused only by higher prices. True economic growth occurs when real GDP increases, reflecting a genuine increase in production. To understand whether people's average standard of living is improving, economists often use real GDP per capita, which also takes into account population growth. Now we have both nominal GDP and real GDP, so we can use the two to answer an important question. How much of the difference between nominal and real GDP is due to prices? That is what the GDP deflator helps us measure. We calculate it as nominal GDP divided by real GDP multiplied by 100. The base year gives us our reference point. So a deflator of 100 just means prices are at the base year level. A deflator greater than or lower than 100 would mean that the prices are higher or lower respectively. A deflator of, let's say, 120 means the overall price level is 20% higher than in the base year. But notice, the deflator tells us the price level relative to the base year. It doesn't tell us the inflation rate for a particular year. So how do we calculate inflation rate? That is the next step. Inflation is about the year-on-year percentage change. So instead of comparing the deflator with the base year, we compare the deflator from year to year, 1 year to the next. That is how we calculate inflation rate. For example, if the deflator rises from 100 to 110, it means inflation is 10%. If it then rises in the year from year 2 to year 3, inflation would be again 10% when the deflator is rising from 110 to 121. But what do you notice here? That the deflator has reached 121 from 100 as the base year, which means prices are 21% above the base year. But the inflation rate is only 10% because we are measuring the change from 110 to 121. So the simplest way to remember this is the GDP deflator tells us where the price level is, inflation as compared to the base year. But inflation rate tells us how fast that price level is changing from 1 year to another year. It is between 2 consecutive years. Now let us attempt one question. Nominal GDP is 500 crores and real GDP is 400 crores. And you have to find GDP deflator and percentage rise in prices. First, we should always write the formula. GDP deflator equals nominal GDP divided by real GDP into 100. Substituting the values 500 by 400 multiplied by 100, this gives us a GDP deflator of 125. Since the base year index is 100, a deflator of 125 means that the overall price level is 25% higher than in the base year. Therefore, the GDP deflator is 125 and prices have increased by 25% relative to the base year. Now let us calculate nominal GDP and real GDP for an economy producing two goods, rice and wheat. Year 1 would be our base year. We begin with nominal GDP for year 2, which uses current year quantities and current year prices. So for rice, we multiply 25 by 120, giving 3000, and for wheat, we multiply 220 by 18, giving 3960. Adding both values, nominal GDP would be 6960, 6,960 rupees. Next, let's calculate real GDP for year 2. Now, this is where we need to be careful. We use current year quantities but keep prices from the base year. So, for rice, we will multiply 20 into 120 and for wheat, 15 into 220, which is what will give us 5,700. Therefore, real GDP is 5,700. Finally, we calculate the GDP deflator, which will be 6,960 nominal GDP divided by real GDP into 100. The value is 122.1. This means the overall price level in year 2 is approximately 22.1% higher than in the base year. Before attempting exam questions, remember a few common mistakes. First, don't treat every rise in nominal GDP as economic growth. Always check whether the quantity produced has actually increased. Second, identify the base year carefully. Remember, base year prices remains fixed while current year quantities change. Mixing up these prices is one of the most common calculation errors. For the GDP deflator, don't forget to multiply the ratio by 100. Also remember, these are few board tips. In the examination, always write the formula before substituting the values. You should interpret your final answer in words, especially in case you're attempting AP or A levels, and also clearly state the base year. Finally, you should use this quick self-check. If prices have risen since the base year, nominal GDP will normally be higher than real GDP. Now, this is a summary for the 3 core ideas. First, nominal GDP, real GDP, and the GDP deflator. And also remember this simple memory rule that nominal GDP changes because of both price and quantity. Real GDP changes only because of quantity. Now it's your turn to apply what you have learned. For question 1, use the GDP deflator formula and rearrange it to calculate real GDP. For question 2, calculate the current year GDP deflator and interpret what it tells you about the price level. Question 3 is conceptual. Explain why real GDP per capita is a better indicator of average economic well-being than nominal GDP and mention one limitation. Pause the video, attempt all 3 questions, and then check your answers in the pinned comment below. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Learn Economics with Anjuli for more economics lessons. See you in the next video.